With all the recent news about PlayStation abandoning physical media in 2028, the biggest concern for many is that it takes ownership away from the consumer. But I've always said, if there is one thing that always has been and always will be the savior of video game preservation, it's emulation. And now, PlayStation 5 emulation is slowly becoming a reality thanks to not one, but two separate PlayStation 5 emulators that are slowly but surely starting to play commercial games. Now, I'm not sure if this is a coincidence or not, or maybe PlayStation's recent announcement lit a fire under many emulation developers and contributors, but suddenly PS5 emulation is front and center, really starting to show signs of progress. Now, the first emulator is known as Sharp EMU, and this is what is known as an experimental PlayStation 5 emulator developed from scratch in C#. Now, the current focus, according to the website, is on accuracy and infrastructure setup rather than game-specific compatibility. Now, the emulator can load a e-boot bin of real games, which means the executable, the PS5 executable of a real PlayStation 5 game, execute native CPU instructions, and partially handle kernel-related functionality. The website goes on to say that several critical components are still missing, including native CPU instructions, reading basic game metadata, including the title, the version information, loading system modules. Now, this one is interesting because an emulator such as RPCS3 requires a PlayStation firmware in order for it to run. Sharp PS4 also requires specific system modules to be applied to the emulator in order for games to work correctly. This currently does not have that, and it does remain to be seen whether these will be required later on. There's also partial support for some kernel functions. There is video output in some games, but this is really the big pull right now. Many games aren't actually hitting SCE video out and AGC stages. Now, for those that may not be familiar with the terminology, AGC is the rendering layer on the PlayStation 5. So the games that do support AGC stages and have video out, this is kind of a major breakthrough, right? But most games don't even get that far. Now, to be clear, Sharp EMU has been outlined as something that is in extremely early stages. Its mainline branch can only boot a very small handful of games, with the most popular one right now being Demon's Souls. Now, to be very clear, Demon's Souls boots to its title PNG, and after around 30 minutes or so, you'll get the SCE screen here. But it promptly then crashes and goes no further. Astrobot is another game that's kind of made the rounds of some clip farmers on Twitter, suggesting that Sony is terrified of PlayStation 5 emulation. In reality, this is very much the same as Demon's Souls. It can boot to its title PNG, and it does go no further. Now, to be clear, there are some forks of the Sharp EMU repository that can boot Astrobot a bit further, rendering into the BINC videos, but not much else. Now, the reason why I'm saying this is not for any other reason other than to say you may have heard a lot of fanfare and noise about PS5 emulation coming in and upsetting Sony and kind of disturbing the landscape of the industry. The reality is, like most emulation timelines, we are very, very early. This is months and months and months of work, if not years away, before games can be considered playable from start to finish. I did want to mention this because it is very important for those that are expecting to be able to run AAA PS5 games via emulation on your PC. And just for a comparison, I went back and looked at PlayStation 4 emulation and the timeline that took, and it took around 4 years from initial emulation known as Spine, which could boot into small games such as Sonic Mania, to what we have today with Sharp PS4 playing games such as Bloodborne at 4K 60 FPS on your PC. So we shouldn't expect anything AAA PS5 playable anytime soon. However, Sharp EMU is a very good start, and I definitely don't want to downplay it. I just want to keep things realistic. And as a fan of all things emulation, Sharp EMU is something I'm very excited about. And just to mention, I feel like these days emulation is very different. Modern emulation has kind of shifted priorities to running and focusing on exclusive console-only titles rather than 100% compatibility. And with the PlayStation 5, unfortunately, that list of console exclusives is very, very low. It's probably less than 10 when we think about it. You've got games such as Demon's Souls, Astro's Playroom, Astrobot. You've got the Silent Hill short message demo, Gran Turismo 7, Ghost of Yotai, and the upcoming Wolverine game. I think we can all agree the number of exclusive PS5 only games is very, very low. So having an emulation solution for these games that are tied to the PS5 is very much welcome. Now, on the GitHub repository for Sharp EMU, you can see here that there has been a ton of activity, and there continues to be a ton of activity. Looking at the Actions tab on the GitHub, you can see that there is a non-stop rolling update of builds being generated almost every single hour from many contributors and developers that are pushing updates. And this means that there has been a strong push into getting into games as quickly as possible. But the PlayStation 5 has many pieces to its architecture. While it is x86 based rather than using traditional emulation, we're using a compatibility or a translation layer, and it means that many parts of the architecture will need to be implemented before we start to see meaningful updates. But this steady drip of small but impactful changes to the emulator means that we'll start to see results sooner rather than later. But being able to get into game and being playable from start to finish, like something like Bloodborne, is still going to take many, many months, like I said, maybe, several years, all things said and done. Now, the second PlayStation 5 emulator that's garnering a lot of interest right now is known as Kyty. Now, Kyty, the emulator, has been around since 2022. It's not a new emulator in any capacity, and its initial purpose was to emulate both PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 5. However, it could only run a very small amount of PlayStation 5 tech demos or homebrew demos, and for years Kyty was an interesting footnote because it was one of the first publicly available projects to demonstrate PlayStation 5 code execution on PC, but it was nowhere near what we would consider a practical emulator. However, just like Sharp EMU in recent times, the project has returned, and there has been a modified fork of Kyty known as KytyPS5. And this now has the capability of booting into some smaller indie games, as well as showing signs of booting into some bigger AAA titles. Now, the current repository only shows a handful of games that are considered playable, including Disgaea 6, Dreaming Sarah, Minecraft Legends, and Silent Hill The Short Message. Now, I booted up Silent Hill The Short Message myself. It is a demo, and it indeed gets to the disclaimer screen, as you can see here. It kind of goes through its intro sequence, but it does subsequently crash. Now, there are some other titles that do get into games, such as Shadow of the Ninja here, and this is not what I would consider playable, but it's definitely getting a lot further on. And there are some various other smaller titles that do boot into Kyty much further along than, say, Sharp EMU. There's also some reports that GTA 5 has reportedly progressed far enough to display loading screens and reach some menu functionality, and these are very impressive milestones. But we have to be clear, just like Sharp EMU, Kyty, just because it's reaching its title screen does not mean a game is playable. And we're talking about things like missing graphics, broken inputs, absent audio, crashes, corrupt save data. We're talking about frame rates that are measured in the seconds per frame. All the positive things we can take away here is that the executable loader is working. A lot of the kernel functions have been implemented. Memory mapping has been implemented and is functioning. There is some semblance of a graphics command processor that's running. The shader recompiler, which is a very important piece of any modern emulation, is something that is up and running, at least in some early stage, and we're getting some meaningful results on screen. There is no PlayStation 5 emulator today, as of the making of this video, that has anything resembling complete commercial game compatibility. So any emulator link out there or any website that claims PlayStation 5 AAA games are running on PC are what I would consider, fraudulent, and you should not click on any link and install those. You should always go to the original source. I wouldn't even download anything that has been linked from a third party, and you should always trust the GitHub pages of both these emulators to keep up to date on exactly what's going on. Now, I think the final thing here I want to mention is some people are going to ask the question, who cares about this stuff? What is the point of running PS5 games on your PC, especially right now when emulation is limited? You're going to get a much better experience on your PlayStation 5 by playing games on original and hardware that was intended. But emulation should not be considered about replacing current hardware. Much of it has to do with the documentation of the hardware, while information, software, and working consoles are still available. Many consoles, as we know, depend on things like online services, account authorizations, digital storefronts, and encrypted storage. And over time, as we know, these servers will start to close down. We're seeing it right now with the PlayStation 3 store. Storage devices fail, development hardware disappears, development motherboards start to fail, disk drives stop working, and documentation becomes increasingly more difficult to obtain. So a PlayStation 5 emulator that's being developed today, albeit still very early on in its life cycle, may not be very interesting right now, but will become broadly useful in many, many years from now. I see something like Dolphin, which went through a similar trajectory. Dolphin, in its infancy, although it was an interesting emulator, wouldn't replace a GameCube or a Nintendo Wii, but these days Dolphin is one of the most mature emulators out there with loads of documentation explaining all the various facets of the Nintendo GameCube and the Nintendo Wii. And the hope is that PlayStation 5 emulation can follow a similar trajectory as it is today. And this research that's being done today will determine the PlayStation 5 library and keep it accessible for decades to come. This, as mentioned at the start of this episode, is true preservation. And this is why emulators such as KytyPS5 and Sharp EMU matter so much, even to this point when no games or hardly any games are actually booting at all. They're creating an independent technical look at how these consoles work and how they behave, albeit in a clean room environment. And that is extremely important for not only emulation, for preservation, and for the future. So yeah, we're nowhere near where some people may have you believe. PlayStation 5 emulation is here. What exists today is very, very crude and very, very basic. Yes, these emulators can run and load native PlayStation 5 executables. However, there is still very much a long way to go. Both of these projects are incomplete. There's many technical problems that will take months or possibly years to solve. And because these are community-based, one or more of these projects could simply disappear or just be gone for many, many years. But this is an exciting milestone for all things PlayStation 5 emulation, because this is the first time where things have kind of moved past these isolated private homebrew experiments. Commercial games, albeit in a small capacity, are revealing how far the underlying system developments have progressed. And look, this is PlayStation 5 emulation in 2026. We're going to continue to cover PS5 emulation as major milestones are hit, but this is the first and hopefully of many updates to come. I'm excited. I think there's definitely really good stuff to come down the pipe, but we are going to leave it here for today's episode. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked it, don't forget to leave me a thumbs up, and we will catch you in the next episode. Bye for now.